So we'll start with the anatomy of the heart. The heart is actually one of three components of the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system is also known as the circulatory system because it circulates blood. The heart is the muscular pump that pumps the blood. Now everyone knows the heart pumps blood. That's why you give chest compressions and CPR, you're moving the blood forward. Well, if the heart is going to pump blood, it must first receive blood. But we call the pumping of the blood cardiac output. What the heart puts out, its performance. That's what it's supposed to do. And on average, it could pump something like 5 liters of blood per minute. In the condition of exercise, it could get up to 35 liters per minute. So it varies depending on the metabolic needs. So think about that, it's cardiac output. But like I said, if the heart must pump blood, it must first receive blood from the veins. So it pumps blood, that's via arteries. Okay. But then veins return blood to the heart. And instead of calling that cardiac output, we would call it venous return. Become very familiar with those physiology terms. Venous return to the heart, cardiac output. The heart receives blood, the heart pumps blood, and the heart pumps blood at a certain rate. So the heart rate, HR, something like 75 beats per minute, BPM, right, your heart rate. And with each beat, the heart will eject 70 ml of blood per beat. Heart ejects about 70 ml blood per beat. So if you do the math, 75 beats per minute, 70 ml, it gets close to this textbook average, 5 liters a minute. They usually base these textbook numbers off the average person that's 5'10", 175 pounds, something like that. So just to give you a rough idea, that's what the heart does. And today we're going to learn the anatomy of it. Now, you pump blood, you need the blood vessels to circulate that blood. And so the vasculature are the blood vessels. And each of these components is its own chapter in the book. We're doing the heart. Heart's its own test, but then the blood vessels is its own test. And then the blood, along with other things, is the next test after that. The blood vessels or vasculature well, there's different kinds. A vessel is a container. So blood vessels are containers for blood. It's well known, and even the basic kinds of blood vessels are well known. I just mentioned the arteries. We'll talk about their structure later. For now, just know that arteries, the rule is they always take blood away from the heart. That's the rule. That's the cardiac output I was mentioning. Take blood away from heart. So you need to know that for the heart lecture. That rule is always true. Use that rule as opposed to, say, for example, capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. The point of arteries of taking blood away from the heart is to deliver them to capillary beds so that the oxygen can be dropped off, for example, in the systemic circulation. Just think of capillaries as an exchange medium. The tissues make exchanges with the blood, talk about that more later. Then you need veins to collect that spent blood and return it to the heart. Collect spent blood. I already said they return it to the heart. I'll say it again. Return to heart. So that's how blood goes round and round. And then the blood itself is what you're circulating. Blood is life-giving. Because it has O2. You're delivering oxygen to all the capillary beds for metabolic needs. Okay? And the molecule that binds hemoglobin, the molecule that binds oxygen in the blood is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin binds O2. It can bind it, it can circulate it, it can drop it off. So it picks up, it drops off, picks up, drops off. We talk about that concept a lot in blood and in the respiratory system. So that's kind of an overview of the cardiovascular system. So you know that blood circulates. You need the heart to keep it pumping, to keep blood flowing. If blood ever stops flowing, you'll have a spontaneous blood clot because you allow time for the clotting factors to accumulate in stagnant flowing blood. And so this is how blood circulates. It's a double loop. We call it the systemic and the pulmonary circuit. A circuit is, it goes out, comes back. Okay? Goes around in a circle. Blood goes round and round. So let's learn how blood circulates. What you learn from this picture is how blood circulates, but you also learn about the heart too, that the heart essentially has a right side and a left side. There's 4 chambers, but you can subdivide it into right and left. The right side is the blue side, right? It's always the patient's perspective. That symbolizes deoxygenated blood. Let's start there, pulmonary circuit. So let's think functionally. Systemic veins, they're returning oxygen-poor blood to the right heart. Right heart receives O2 poor blood. So if blood is O2 poor, you want it to get oxygenated. It's the job of the right heart to pump it to the lungs. Pumps blood to lungs via pulmonary arteries. They're blue, symbolizing they carry deoxygenated blood. Arteries always take blood away from the heart. So you force this deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary capillaries to pick up oxygen. So you go through pulmonary capillaries. I'll underline it half blue, half red because you're picking up O2. So these are the capillaries where the exchange is such. You breathe the fresh air in the lungs, and the capillaries pick up that oxygen in the fresh air you breathe. And the pulmonary veins collect that blood and return it to the left heart. Pulmonary vein. Remember, vein in, return blood in the heart, to the heart. Pulmonary veins, return blood to left heart. Now oxygenated. So we went out and we came back. So that's the pulmonary circuit. So then you start from the left heart and talk about the systemic circuit. It's the job of the left heart to pump blood to the whole body. Left heart receives oxygenated blood from lungs. Via pulmonary veins. Okay, so then left heart pumps blood via systemic arteries to systemic capillaries of the whole body, basically. To systemic capillaries. Of the whole body. So systemic veins will collect this spent blood and return it to the right heart. Systemic veins collect quote unquote spent blood. That means you dropped off the O2. Return it to right heart. That's where we started from. So just to kind of underline like I did before, left heart received blood from pulmonary veins, which had just been oxygenated. When you follow the chart, then you pump it out through the aorta, namely all of the systemic arteries. It's the job of the arteries to deliver blood to the whole body. When you force it through systemic capillaries, you're dropping off the O2, so it changes from red to blue, right? Symbolizing deoxygenated blood. I mean, there's no such thing as blue blood, it's just a symbol. Okay, you can look at I can see my veins, they look kind of greenish blue, but blood is red. Systemic capillaries, then you have systemic veins collecting all the blood and returning it to the heart. Okay, so that's the very basic idea of how blood circulates. You have two pumps, the right and the left. So you receive blood, you pump blood. And more about the structure of blood vessels later. But when you look at a picture like this, it's good to know that's where things are coming and going, right? So this is kind of the classic picture of the heart frontal section. You can see the structures, the basic things you gotta know. One of the things I like to point out is that this is not how the heart sits in the body. What I like about our stands, the heart model on the stand, is how the heart sits in the chest. That's the right perspective. So if I make this match that, if I take it off, the picture kind of makes the heart go like that. So you have a more frontal view of everything. But really in the body, it sits like this. Okay, so this is correct how it sits in the body. This is just for like illustration purposes. That's what they show you there. Kind of like, I don't want you to think that, the atria are above the ventricles. They're not, they're behind them. Okay, so let's go through the chambers of the heart. So the first thing you know about heart anatomy, 4 chambers that receive and pump blood. And before I erase it, the most important of all the blood vessels I listed, I guess I listed 6 things. I listed pulmonary arteries, pulmonary capillaries, pulmonary veins, that's 3. And the other 3 were systemic arteries, systemic capillaries, systemic veins. There's another 3. The systemic arteries are the most important, okay? Because that's what you monitor in patients, that blood pressure, that pushes blood to capillaries, okay? That is what keeps us alive. We've all gotten our blood pressure measured. 120/80, textbook average. That is pressure. Now, it's 2 numbers because there's a period of the cardiac cycle where the heart relaxes when it fills with blood. There's a part where it contracts when it pumps the blood and generates a higher pressure. So with the blood vessel, that's why we observe a pressure rise and a pressure drop off in the artery. But anyways, what that number tells you in the systemic arteries is, well, depending on where you take it, usually it's the brachial artery. It tells you there's enough pressure to push blood to the capillaries. If this pressure drops, blood might stop flowing. You might go into shock. So that's why that's important. Now, the units are millimeters of mercury. That's the unit of pressure, the pressure it takes to displace a column of fluid, in this case mercury. So anyways, I want to highlight that because blood pressure is a vital sign of life, like breathing, like pulse. So the anatomy of the heart is that you have 4 chambers. And blood doesn't mix on either side of the heart, right or left, or in any of these chambers here. So the 4 chambers of the heart, well, let's do the 2 receiving chambers first. 2 are atria, 2 atria. These are the receiving chambers. They receive blood. You have one on the right, one on the left. Right atrium, left atrium. RA for short. Left atrium, LA for short. And so let me point to them. Make sure you know what I'm talking about. Right atrium, right there, that chamber. And then left atrium. It's always the patient's perspective, correct? That's the right, that's the left, of the patient, not as you look at it. Now, the right atrium, well, if they receive blood, that must mean veins drain into them, right? Veins return blood to the heart, they return it to the atria. So know the veins that drain into these chambers. For the right atrium, it's superior, inferior vena cava. Superior vena cava, the big veins, and inferior vena cava. There's a third one, can't see it from this angle. It's the coronary sinus. I'll point them out to you in a second, the ones you can't see on this view. In the left atrium, there are 4 pulmonary veins that drain oxygenated blood to the left atrium. 4 pulmonary veins. And you should be able to distinguish 2 right and 2 left pulmonary veins. Or if they're on the right or the left, basically. So let's do those first. Here's the 2 on the right, here's the 2 on the left, pulmonary veins. They all drain into the left atrium. And this one up here, superior, inferior vena cava, you can't see the coronary sinus. They're all taking deoxygenated blood to there. The oxygenated blood is returned to that chamber. Okay. Remember, these are behind the ventricles, which are illustrated below here. The other thing you have are the two ventricles, and these are the pumping chambers. I'll just go two ventricles, pump blood. You got RV and LV. Right ventricle, left ventricle. All right, so if your job is to pump blood, once you're filled up with blood, then you can pump it. And so think about the artery that you pump blood into. If you're on the right side, remember your job as a chamber was to pump blood to the lungs. So the name of the artery that pumps blood to the lungs is called the pulmonary trunk. It's illustrated right here. It's a singular trunk that immediately branches into the right and left pulmonary arteries. So the pulmonary trunk is an artery. The right ventricle pumps blood into it. On the left ventricle, it's the aorta, the main systemic vein that will distribute blood to the whole body, the aorta. That's what the left ventricle pumps blood into. So these are both the big arteries. Okay. So you can see it right here, the big red aorta versus the pulmonary trunk. Again, the colors just reminds you oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. The valves, there are 4 of them. There are 4 heart valves. Let's change that word to valves. The purpose of a valve is to prevent backwards flow of blood. The two that are easiest to view from the picture are called the atrioventricular valves, one on the right and one on the left. Two atrioventricular valves. So you have the right AV valve, left AV valve, right AV valve, also known as the tricuspid valve. Got 3 cusps in that valve. And then the left AV valve. Now that one is also known as bicuspid valve or mitral valve. Call it any of those 3 things. Just know which one it is. I mean, these are the atrioventricular valves, so they're the ones that are between the atria and the ventricles. Okay. Now, it turns out these 2 valves, they have a special anatomy here where you have the cusp of a valve. That's the membrane that actually is the valve part. But these have associated structures that are not part of the valve, but you know. They're these little heartstrings connected to the cusp. You can see them in the picture. The proper anatomy name is chordae tendineae. That's the one you got in there. Chordae tendineae, the heartstrings. Now the nipple-shaped muscle, papilla means nipple-shaped, papillary muscle. The way they've illustrated them on the picture is they're open. And when they open, notice how they open into the ventricles. So this is for filling. When they're open, the ventricles fill with blood. Blood flows straight through the atria right into the ventricles. Open into ventricles. If you have trouble trying to figure out which one's bi, which one's tri, just remember lab rat. Left atria bicuspid, right atria tricuspid. Okay, just not to confuse one with the other. The other two are semilunar valves. They open into arteries. Let me erase this. Now, the thing about it is, well, the full name is semilunar valves. I abbreviate that SL most of the time. So these valves are of the arteries. And so we have one that's a pulmonary valve. Pulmonary SL valve. And you have one that's an aortic semilunar valve. These valves open into the arteries. So you should know that the pulmonary SL valve, that's the valve. When it's closed, it's a partition between the pulmonary trunk and the right ventricle. So the RV, when it fills with blood and pumps it through that valve into the pulmonary trunk. The thing about the right ventricle is, I should have mentioned this prior, it's shaped differently than the left ventricle. On the right side, you have this part where the ventricle kind of funnels into a cone-shaped thing. Okay? And they call this part where it funnels up to the artery the conus arteriosus. That's something you don't have on the left side. So RV has conus arteriosus. You funnel blood up that little cone, you open the valve, you push that open, and you pump blood into the pulmonary trunk. Okay. So the aortic semilunar valve, that's it's the job of the left ventricle to pump blood through that valve into the aorta. Okay, so those are the other two valves that you have to know. These valves are just cusps. And there's no heartstrings or papillary muscles to know there. The word semilunar means each cusp looks like a half moon shape. Okay, but we'll see that each of these valves has about 3 cusps. All right, let's see here. Well, let's do this. Let's look at wake up my iPad. I was using the app on the previous. Let me reset something and I'll show it to you. This is the app, anatomy app, and it has the heart isolated. And I want to show you a few things. I like that they show the beating heart, okay? So we can kind of look at that, turn some of the lights off. And I guess what you should notice, you should be able to figure out what the 4 chambers are. You see those 2 things at the top that look like ears? I'll let you look and I'll point to it. That's the right auricle and the left auricle. You have to know that. Right and left auricles. They're part of the atrium. They're pulsating at the top here. There's the one on the right. Little Dumbo ears. Auricle means ear. That's why I said ears. These are ears. They fill with blood. They're part of the atria. They're one and the same, basically. They beat at the same time, and then the 2 ventricles beat at the same time. They're never all 4 at once. Okay. These 2 contract, and then the bottom 2 contract the ventricles. So the 2 ventricles, you can tell the 2 by looking for one landmark. This whitish line here, that's the anterior interventricular sulcus. That's the division between right ventricle, left ventricle. Anterior interventricular sulcus. A sulcus is a groove, but anyways, it happens to be right on the septum between the 2 ventricles. So that's why it's a landmark. You see it, you know the 2 ventricles. They're the big boys. They're the pumpers. Okay, it's the big muscle part of the heart. You can rotate this around. You can see that the atria are on the back. So there's more or less a posterior view. So we can see the auricle is up here. That's the right atrium. So this whole thing is the right atrium, making that superior, inferior vena cava. Here's the left atrium. So these are 4 what? Pulmonary veins. Remember, vein in. These are delivering blood to the heart. So remember, the atria are behind the ventricles. And blood flows forward from atria to ventricle. They never contract at the same time. This contracts and then that contracts. So we'll get into the cardiac cycle later. If what you could do is you could double tap it to stop it beating if you want to not see it beat. What I want to do is I'm going to highlight part of the heart wall. That is the wall of the right ventricle. Let's hide it so we can see inside the heart. And let's go the other side. And let's highlight the left ventricle and hide it. We can see inside there. We get it beating again. So in this view here, we have 4 heart valves. Which 2 are these? AV or SL? AV. Okay? See how they open and close at the same time? Okay. Is this right or left side? Right is correct. It's cool. You can see the heartstrings and papillary muscles, how they kind of control the opening and closing. The other 2 are the SL valves. So let's look at them one at a time. This is the right heart. So this is the AV valve opening and closing, allowing blood to fill in the right ventricle. Name that valve. Pulmonary semilunar valve. 1, 2, 3 cuff. See how it opens and closes there? When you open it, blood is going to be pumped into the artery. Okay. Well, when it's closed, I mean that's time for filling. Now let's look at the aortic valve here. It's hard to see, it's out of sight, so you have to really tilt it and zoom in. You can see it right there. Right, that's the aortic valve. All right. I may come back to this later. Yeah?
So, which one would be so for like a widowmaker, is that the little thing that ruptures, or?
Oh, the widowmaker, let me show that
is
to
that
you.
more on top?
It refers to a coronary vessel. Let me reset. There's a coronary blood vessel that runs down the anterior interventricular sulcus. It's called the anterior interventricular artery. It's one of the biggest arteries that supplies blood to the heart. If you have a heart attack, it's because that blood vessel became clogged and causing a massive heart attack, hence the term widowmaker. And usually they say widowmaker because men are more prone to heart disease than women.
And is that like hypertrophy?
Is that what?
Hypertrophy when that happens? Like,
Oh yeah, atrophy, the heart muscle dies.
yeah.
Heart attack takes about 2 hours, and the heart becomes an inefficient pump. You can survive a heart attack.
Yeah.
If enough muscle is left that didn't die, you'll survive. You just have scar tissue there. But if enough tissue dies and you can't pump enough blood, that's lethal. Okay. Let me go back to this picture here. So this is kind of an easy exercise in terms of just practicing how the blood circulates by following a little squirt of blood as it proceeds through our double loop. And you should be able to name all the heart structures as you go along. So they start with SBC, IBC. I'll write it up here. They use blue for deoxygenated blood. I'm basically just going to follow the figure starting where they start up here, starting with pulmonary circuit, right? Then you go to the right atrium. RA. Then you go through the tricuspid valve. Then you're in the right ventricle, the RV. The job of the RV to pump blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve. Then you're in the pulmonary trunk. And then you get to the lungs. Now you're into the pulmonary capillaries. So I'm going to draw the capillary bed half blue and half red to symbolize that the blood has picked up oxygen. So I'm just going to write pulmonary capillary for short. Pul capillary. Well, anyways, it's the job of the 4 pulmonary veins, pul veins, that will deliver this oxygenated blood to the left atrium, LA. And then blood will flow forward from LA through an open bicuspid valve to the LV. And then from the LV, you'll pump blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. And it's the job of the aorta to distribute blood to the whole body to systemic capillaries. So I'll draw this capillary bed, half red, half blue. cap. And basically, you're back where we started, because the veins will return it to the right heart. You can start over again. So that's kind of what they take you through here, the double loop, right? But now I've named all the chambers, and you should be able to do that walking in your sleep. Okay, so just keep practicing until you have it memorized, or maybe you have it memorized already. But that's pretty easy. If you can't do that with ease, stop and wait till you can before you get into the details. Well, some other details. I want you to know how the heart sits in the chest. It's in the mediastinum. That's the name of the body cavity. Here's a couple of pictures to help us with that. If you remove the chest wall, most people expect to see a bleeding heart, but this is kind of more typical what I see. You kind of have to move the lungs aside. You can barely see just a bit of the fibrous pericardium. The lungs occupy most of the space in the thoracic cavity. If you look at a sectional view, you can see that the heart in the mediastinum is sandwiched between the two lungs. And what we see is that the right heart is a little more anterior. That's the right atrium, right ventricle. So the right heart is a little more anterior than the left heart. Okay, you write that down. And the heart is really close to the midline, right in the middle of the chest. Maybe slightly to the left. And when you put your hand over your heart, they tell you to put it over the left side, but it's really closer to the midline, maybe just slightly to the left. If you look at this next picture, there's a model we used to have. Anyways, I took the same section as this was, because I want you to be able, in the chest cavity, you should be able to identify the 4 chambers of the heart. Right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. That should be easy for you to do. All right, let's talk about the covering of the heart in the chest cavity. It's called the pericardium. The covering of the heart is like a water-filled balloon, and if you take the heart and shove it inside, this is a pretty good illustration of what it's like. Okay, the pericardium, the covering of the heart. So what we learned about this covering of the heart, there's a parietal and visceral layer, right? So it's double layer. The visceral layer is intimate with the heart. There's a fluid-filled cavity in between, then you have the parietal layer. Okay. So all right, it's a covering of the heart. It prevents overfilling. And it's also attached to the heart itself. In this picture, we see that the pericardium, it's attached to the great vessels of the heart superiorly, or right here. Kind of show that right there. And you can see there's a part blown up. The pericardium attaches to the great vessels. The great vessels of the heart include aorta, SVC, superior vena cava, and pulmonary trunk. That's usually what people mean when they say the great vessels. Well, the pericardium attaches to it, and then inferiorly, it also attaches to the diaphragm. Attaches to diaphragm. So right there. Fibrous part attaches to the diaphragm. That's right above your stomach, actually. So this figure is supposed to teach us the layers of the heart wall. I mean, the heart is basically like steak. It's all muscle. But we do have to notice these other things that cover it. So notice how the parietal pericardium, there's two parts. There's a fibrous part and a serous part. It's only a So under pericardium, I'm going to list parietal, pericardium. There's a fibrous as well as a serous part. The serous part is a membrane. I mean, it secretes fluid. It's a serous membrane. Okay, so check fibrous, serous. The fibrous part gives it toughness. It helps it attach to things, like I said, through the great vessels. But notice how the serous part, as it turns onto the heart, it becomes the visceral pericardium. It's one and the same as the epicardium of the heart wall. Okay, so let's go visceral pericardium. There's serous only. Okay, and I should mention in between parietal and visceral is the pericardial cavity. It's fluid filled. But when you get to the visceral layer, you'll see it on your sheep heart dissection on Monday. The sheep heart, all hearts have this visceral pericardium, and it's very glistening and smooth. You'll see that on your heart. Usually the parietal part's been removed at the slaughterhouse. The visceral pericardium, being serous, is one and the same as the epicardium, the outermost layer of the heart wall. So AKA epicardium. So from here, this is where heart wall starts. The visceral pericardium. Then you have the bulk of the heart wall, the myocardium. Okay, it's all the muscle parts. For now, I'll just say it's cardiac muscle. There's three muscle types: cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. In identifying it as a tissue, students always misidentify it by calling it cardiac tissue. That's incorrect. It's muscle. Okay. Yeah. And then the lining on the inside is the endocardium. Touches the blood that fills the chambers. So I'll just write that, touches blood. I won't say too much more about heart wall. It's mostly muscle. Another view of the heart, instead of this close-up view, is to view it inside the thoracic cavity from the side view. So you have to kind of chop off the shoulder, so to speak. You have the left side and the right side, and what I try to impress upon students is the artery is on the left, the vein is on the right. That's why they call it red side, blue side. Because on the left side, you tend to have the aorta. That is the thoracic aorta you see on the left side. You don't see the superior vena cava, that's on the right side. Okay, that right there. So the left side's the red side, associate left aorta. Okay, in your head, associate right. That's where the veins are. SVC. You can't see the inferior vena cava in the thoracic cavity. As soon as it goes through the diaphragm, it disappears into the heart. So the inferior vena cava has no length in the thoracic cavity. So that's kind of what's said about it. Put that as a side note. IVC has no length in the thoracic cavity. Oh, I already mentioned the great vessels of the heart. It's in your notes. Superior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk. Okay? This is a good place to stop. I know you guys have a test today. Pause that. Looking at the clock, I know how much time.